The restoration studio at the Mountain Heritage Institute occupied the entire third floor of a converted textile mill in Boone, North Carolina, where natural light poured through enormous windows that had once illuminated rows of looms and spinning machines. Dr. James Crawford had worked in this space for nearly 15 years, carefully restoring paintings and photographs that documented the history of the Appalachian region. His expertise in art conservation had earned him a reputation throughout the Southeast, and institutions regularly sent him their most challenging projects, knowing that his meticulous approach and deep knowledge of historical materials would yield results that other conservators might miss. James took pride in his work, viewing each damaged painting or faded photograph not merely as an object to be repaired, but as a window into the past that deserved to be cleared of the accumulated grime and damage of decades or centuries so that future generations could see through it clearly. The Institute itself was a relatively young organization, founded just 20 years earlier by a group of historians and community leaders who recognized that the material culture of the mountain region was disappearing at an alarming rate. Old photographs were being thrown away as families cleaned out attics, paintings were deteriorating in damp basements, documents were being lost to floods and fires and simple neglect. The Institute had made it their mission to locate, acquire, and preserve these materials, building a collection that now numbered in the tens of thousands of items. James worked closely with the curatorial staff, helping them assess the condition of newly acquired materials and prioritize conservation work based on both the physical state of the objects and their historical significance. It was demanding work that required patience, steady hands, and an almost obsessive attention to detail, qualities that James possessed in abundance. On a humid morning in late June, James stood at his primary workstation, examining a large oil portrait that had arrived at the Institute 3 weeks earlier. The painting depicted a wealthy family from the early 1900s, the kind of formal portrait that prosperous families of that era commissioned to document their status and leave a legacy for future generations. The family was arranged in the typical hierarchical composition of the period, with the patriarch seated in the center, his wife standing beside him with one hand resting on his shoulder, and their 4 children positioned around them in descending order of age. Everyone wore their finest clothes, the women in elaborate dresses with high collars, and the men in dark suits with stiff white shirts. The background showed the interior of what appeared to be a well-appointed parlor, with heavy curtains, ornate furniture, and decorative objects that spoke of wealth and refinement. The painting had come to the Institute as part of an estate donation from the descendants of the Whitfield family, prominent landowners who had made their fortune in timber and mining during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The accompanying documentation identified the subjects as Thomas Whitfield, his wife Catherine, and their children, painted in 1901 by an itinerant artist who had traveled through the region painting portraits of wealthy families. The painting had hung in the family's main house for decades before being moved to storage when the property was sold in the 1960s. It had suffered some damage over the years, with areas of paint loss, surface dirt, and a yellowed varnish layer that obscured the original colors. The Whitfield descendants had requested that the Institute restore the painting before including it in an upcoming exhibition about prominent Appalachian families, and James had agreed to take on the project, despite his already full schedule. James had begun the restoration process by conducting a thorough examination of the painting under various types of light, a standard procedure that often revealed details invisible to the naked eye under normal conditions. He had photographed the painting with regular light, then with raking light that highlighted surface texture and any areas where the paint layer had been disturbed. He had also examined it under ultraviolet light, which caused old varnish to fluoresce and made it possible to see areas where the painting had been retouched or repaired in the past. It was during this UV examination that James noticed something unexpected. In the lower right corner of the composition, in an area that appeared to show empty floor space in the normal light photographs, the UV light revealed a distinct rectangular shape where the fluorescence pattern was different from the surrounding area. The shape was roughly the size and proportion of a human figure, and the edges were too sharp and deliberate to be accidental damage or a natural variation in the varnish layer. James spent the remainder of that day and most of the next examining the anomalous area more closely, using every tool and technique at his disposal to understand what he was seeing. He took dozens of photographs under different lighting conditions, made detailed notes about the paint layers and their characteristics, and consulted reference materials about painting techniques and materials from the early 1900s. The more he studied the area, the more convinced he became that someone had deliberately painted over a portion of the original composition, covering something that had been there when the artist first completed the work. The overpainting was skillfully done, matching the colors and brushwork of the surrounding area well enough that it was invisible under normal viewing conditions, but the materials used were slightly different from the original paint, causing them to fluoresce differently under UV light. The discovery raised immediate questions that James found both fascinating and troubling. Why would someone paint over part of a formal family portrait, and what had been covered up? The location of the overpainted area in the lower right of the composition, where a standing figure would logically be positioned, suggested that an entire person had been removed from the painting. James considered various explanations as he worked. Perhaps one of the children had died young and the family had found it too painful to see their image in the portrait. Perhaps there had been a falling out between family members, and someone had been symbolically erased from the family record. Or perhaps the explanation was more mundane, a damaged area that had been repaired by painting over it, rather than attempting a more careful restoration. Each theory had problems, and James knew he needed more information before he could draw any conclusions. James decided to consult with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the Institute's chief curator and a historian who specialized in Appalachian social history. Rebecca had an encyclopedic knowledge of the region's prominent families and had worked extensively with the Whitfield family papers when they were donated to the Institute several years earlier. James called her office and asked if she could come to the studio to look at something unusual he had found in the portrait. Rebecca arrived within the hour, her curiosity clearly piqued by James's cryptic description. He showed her the painting under normal light first, then switched to UV illumination and pointed out the rectangular area of different fluorescence. Rebecca leaned close to examine the area, then stepped back and studied the overall composition with a thoughtful expression. After several minutes of silent examination, Rebecca asked James if he could determine what was under the overpaint without damaging the painting. James explained that he could attempt to remove the later paint layer carefully, working in small, test areas first to ensure he could do so safely. The process would be time-consuming and delicate, requiring solvents that would dissolve the newer paint without affecting the original layer beneath. There was always some risk in such work, but James was confident he could reveal what had been hidden without causing harm to the painting. Rebecca considered this information, then told James about something she had encountered while cataloging the Whitfield papers. There had been references in family correspondence from the early 1900s to a controversy involving the portrait, mentions of disagreements and hurt feelings, but the letters had been vague, and she had not pursued the matter further at the time. Rebecca returned to her office and spent the afternoon searching through the Whitfield collection for any documents that might shed light on the portrait and its history. She found several letters from 1901 and 1902 that mentioned the painting, including one from Catherine Whitfield to her sister, in which she expressed distress about a decision Thomas had made regarding the portrait. The letter was frustratingly indirect, as personal correspondence of that era often was when discussing matters the writer considered sensitive or shameful, but it clearly indicated that something about the portrait had caused significant conflict within the family. Rebecca also found a receipt from a local painter dated 1903 for work described as alterations to family portrait, which seemed to confirm that the painting had been modified sometime after its original completion. She gathered these documents and returned to James's studio, where they spent the rest of the afternoon discussing what they had learned and debating whether to proceed with removing the overpaint. James began the delicate process of removing the overpaint on a Monday morning, working in a small test area at the edge of the rectangular shape he had identified. He used cotton swabs dipped in carefully selected solvents, working under magnification and testing each swab on blotter paper to monitor how much paint was being removed. The work required intense concentration and could only be done for short periods before his eyes and hands grew tired. After 2 hours of painstaking effort, he had cleared an area about the size of a quarter, revealing, beneath the beige overpaint, a section of dark fabric that appeared to be part of a garment. The discovery confirmed his suspicion that a human figure had been painted over, and he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what he would find as he continued the work. Over the following 2 weeks, James worked steadily to remove the overpaint, gradually revealing the hidden figure. What emerged was the image of a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s, standing at the right edge of the family group. He wore simple work clothes rather than the formal attire of the Whitfield family members, dark trousers and a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His posture was slightly different from the stiff formality of the others, more relaxed and natural, and his expression was serious but not stern. The artist had painted him with the same care and attention to detail as the family members, capturing individual features and personality in a way that suggested this was a portrait of a real person rather than a generic figure added to fill space in the composition. As more of the figure became visible, James noticed other details that set this person apart from the Whitfield family. His hands showed signs of manual labor, with prominent veins and a weathered appearance that contrasted with the soft, well-kept hands of Thomas Whitfield. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been working outdoors before being called in for the portrait sitting. Most strikingly, his skin tone was darker than that of the pale Whitfield family, suggesting he might have been of mixed race or perhaps simply deeply tanned from outdoor work. James documented each stage of the removal process with photographs, creating a visual record of the figure's gradual reappearance after more than a century of concealment. Rebecca visited the studio frequently during this period, watching the progress and researching the Whitfield family history with renewed intensity. She had expanded her search beyond the Institute's collection, reaching out to other archives and historical societies that might have relevant materials. She discovered that the Whitfield family had employed numerous workers in their timber and mining operations, and that Thomas Whitfield had a reputation as a demanding but generally fair employer who maintained better relationships with his workers than many of his peers. She found payroll records that listed dozens of names, but without knowing the identity of the painted-over figure, she could not determine which, if any, of these workers might be the person in the portrait. She also found newspaper articles about the Whitfield family from the early 1900s, society page mentions of parties and events, and business news about their various enterprises, but nothing that explained why someone would have been painted out of the family portrait. The breakthrough came when Rebecca located a diary kept by one of Catherine Whitfield's daughters, a woman named Elizabeth, who had been about 12 years old when the portrait was painted. The diary had been donated to a small historical society in a neighboring county by one of Elizabeth's descendants, and Rebecca had to travel there to examine it since the collection had not been digitized. Elizabeth's entries from 1901 described the process of sitting for the family portrait, complaining about having to remain still for long periods, and about the uncomfortable formal dress she had to wear. More significantly, she mentioned that Samuel had been included in the portrait at her mother's insistence, despite her father's objections. Samuel was described as someone who had been with the family for many years, and whom Catherine considered part of the household, though Elizabeth's entries suggested that Thomas viewed the matter differently, and that the inclusion of Samuel in the portrait had been a source of ongoing tension. Rebecca returned from her research trip with photocopies of the relevant diary pages, and a growing sense that the story behind the painted-over figure was more complex and potentially more significant than a simple family disagreement. She and James spent an evening in his studio examining the now fully revealed figure while Rebecca read aloud from Elizabeth's diary entries. The young woman's observations, filtered through the perspective of a 12-year-old girl in 1901, painted a picture of a household where Samuel occupied an ambiguous position, treated with affection and respect by Catherine and the children, but regarded with discomfort by Thomas. Elizabeth wrote about how Samuel had taught her to identify birds and plants on walks through the woods, how he had carved toys for the younger children, and how her mother consulted him about household matters and seemed to value his opinions in a way that went beyond the typical relationship between an employer and a worker. James and Rebecca began to construct a hypothesis about what had happened. Samuel had clearly been important to Catherine Whitfield, important enough that she had insisted he be included in the family portrait despite her husband's reservations. The portrait had been completed with Samuel in it, standing at the edge of the family group in a position that acknowledged his connection to the family while also marking him as separate from it. But sometime between the portrait's completion in 1901 and the alterations made in 1903, something had changed. Thomas Whitfield had decided that Samuel's presence in the portrait was unacceptable and had hired a painter to remove him from the image. The question that remained was why, and what had become of Samuel himself. Rebecca expanded her research to include regional newspapers from the period, searching for any mention of Samuel in connection with the Whitfield family. She found nothing in the society pages or business news, but she eventually located a brief article from late 1902 in a newspaper that served the working class and African American communities in the region. The article reported that a young man named Samuel Garrett had died in an accident at one of the Whitfield timber operations, crushed by a falling tree that he had been attempting to cut. The article noted that Garrett had been employed by the Whitfield family for many years and was mourned by those who knew him. The sparse details and the placement of the article in a minor newspaper suggested that Samuel's death had not been considered newsworthy by the mainstream press, despite his apparent closeness to one of the region's most prominent families. The discovery of Samuel's death provided a potential explanation for why he had been painted out of the portrait, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Had Thomas Whitfield removed Samuel from the portrait as a way of erasing the memory of someone whose presence had made him uncomfortable, or had the removal been done at Catherine's request, perhaps because seeing Samuel's image was too painful after his death? Rebecca found another letter from Catherine to her sister, written in early 1903, in which she mentioned that Thomas had insisted on having the portrait altered and that she had not had the strength to fight him on the matter. The letter's tone suggested grief and resignation, implying that the removal of Samuel's image had been Thomas's decision and that Catherine had acquiesced despite her own feelings. James completed the removal of all the overpaint, revealing Samuel Garrett in full for the first time in over a century. The young man stood at the edge of the Whitfield family, his work clothes and weathered hands marking him as someone who belonged to a different social class. But his inclusion in the portrait and the care with which the artist had painted him, suggesting that he had been valued and respected, at least by some members of the family. James took high-resolution photographs of the restored painting, documenting both the overall composition and detailed close-ups of Samuel's face and figure. He and Rebecca studied these images, trying to read in Samuel's expression some hint of his thoughts and feelings about being included in this portrait of a family that was not quite his own. Rebecca decided that the story of Samuel Garrett and his removal from the Whitfield family portrait deserved to be told publicly, both as a piece of regional history and as a case study in how historical narratives are constructed and sometimes deliberately altered. She proposed to the Institute's director that they create an exhibition centered on the restored portrait, using it as a focal point for exploring themes of labor, family memory, and the ways that power shapes whose stories are preserved and whose are erased. The director was enthusiastic about the project, recognizing its potential to attract attention and spark important conversations about the region's history. Rebecca was given approval to proceed and a budget that would allow her to conduct additional research and create interpretive materials for the exhibition. The first challenge Rebecca faced was learning more about Samuel Garrett himself, moving beyond the bare facts of his employment and death to understand who he had been as a person. She returned to the Whitfield family papers and read through them more carefully, looking for any mention of Samuel in correspondence, account books, or other documents. She found his name in payroll records going back to 1895, when he would have been about 15 years old, suggesting he had worked for the family for at least 6 years before the portrait was painted. She also found several references to Samuel in Catherine's letters to family members, mentions of his helpfulness, his knowledge of the woods and wildlife, and his kindness to the children. One letter from 1899 described how Samuel had stayed up all night, helping to nurse one of the Whitfield children through a serious illness, a level of dedication that went well beyond what would be expected of an ordinary employee. Rebecca also searched for information about Samuel's own family and background, hoping to find descendants who might have photographs, documents, or family stories that could add depth to his biography. This proved more difficult, as records of working-class families from that era were sparse and often poorly preserved. She eventually located a death certificate that listed Samuel's parents as Robert and Martha Garrett, and census records that showed the Garrett family living in a small community about 5 miles from the Whitfield estate. Robert Garrett was listed as a laborer, and the family appeared to have been poor but stable. Samuel had 2 younger siblings, a brother and a sister, who would have been children when he died. Rebecca wondered if these siblings had lived long enough to have children and grandchildren of their own, and whether any of those descendants might still be living in the region. Rebecca placed notices in local newspapers and on genealogy websites, explaining that she was researching Samuel Garrett and asking anyone with information about him or his family to contact the Institute. The response was slow at first, but after a few weeks she received an email from a woman named Dorothy Jenkins, who lived in Tennessee. Dorothy explained that her grandmother had been Samuel Garrett's younger sister, and that family stories about Samuel had been passed down through the generations. According to these stories, Samuel had been a bright and capable young man who had hoped to attend school and perhaps become a teacher, but who had needed to work to help support his family. The Whitfield family had employed him and treated him well, and he had been particularly close to Mrs. Whitfield, who had encouraged his interest in learning and had lent him books from the family's library. Dorothy agreed to meet with Rebecca and share what she knew about Samuel and the Garrett family. They met at a coffee shop in Asheville, and Dorothy brought with her a small box of family materials that included a few photographs, some letters, and a Bible that had belonged to Samuel. The photographs showed the Garrett family at various points in the early 1900s, including one image that Dorothy identified as Samuel, probably taken around 1900. The young man in the photograph matched the figure that James had revealed in the Whitfield portrait, confirming the identification. The letters included several that Samuel had written to his mother during the last year of his life, describing his work and his hopes for the future. In one letter from the summer of 1902, just a few months before his death, Samuel mentioned that Mrs. Whitfield had asked him to be included in a family portrait they were having painted, and that he was honored, but also somewhat uncomfortable with the idea, unsure of his proper place in such a formal representation of the family. The materials Dorothy shared transformed Rebecca's understanding of Samuel Garrett and his relationship with the Whitfield family, providing personal details and emotional context that the official records had lacked. Samuel's letters revealed him to be thoughtful and articulate, with a clear writing style that suggested he had indeed pursued education despite the demands of his work. He wrote about his daily tasks in the timber operations with a mixture of pride in his competence and frustration at the physical toll the work took on his body. He mentioned his dreams of saving enough money to attend a normal school and become a teacher in one of the mountain communities where educated instructors were desperately needed. Most poignantly, he wrote about his gratitude to Catherine Whitfield for her kindness and encouragement, describing her as someone who saw potential in him that others overlooked and who treated him with a respect that transcended the usual boundaries between employer and employee. Rebecca asked Dorothy about the family stories concerning Samuel's death and what had happened afterward. Dorothy explained that the official account of an accident had always been accepted by the family, but there had been whispers and suggestions over the years that the circumstances might have been more complicated than they appeared. Samuel's mother, Martha, had apparently believed that her son's death was not simply an unfortunate accident, but the result of negligence or perhaps even something more deliberate, though she had never been able to prove anything and had lacked the resources and social standing to challenge the Whitfield family's version of events. After Samuel's death, the Whitfield family had provided some financial assistance to the Garrett family, paying for the funeral and giving Martha a sum of money that had helped support the family for several months, but there had been no ongoing relationship between the families and no acknowledgement of Samuel's years of service beyond the brief newspaper obituary. Dorothy also shared a detail that Rebecca found particularly significant. According to family tradition, Catherine Whitfield had attended Samuel's funeral, arriving alone and staying only briefly, but her presence had been noted and remembered because it was unusual for someone of her social position to attend the funeral of a worker. Martha Garrett had apparently been moved by this gesture and had told her children that Mrs. Whitfield had genuinely cared for Samuel and had been deeply affected by his death. This information aligned with what Rebecca had found in Catherine's letters, the expressions of grief and the suggestion that the removal of Samuel from the portrait had been done against her wishes. Rebecca began to see the painted-over figure not just as an interesting historical mystery, but as evidence of a relationship that had crossed social boundaries in ways that made some people uncomfortable and that had ultimately been erased from the official family record. Armed with this new information, Rebecca returned to the Whitfield family papers and re-examined them with fresh eyes, looking for any additional clues about the relationship between Catherine and Samuel and about the circumstances of his death. She found a letter from Thomas Whitfield to his business partner, written a few weeks after Samuel's death, mentioning the accident in passing and noting that it had caused some disruption to their operations, but that a replacement worker had been found. The casual tone of the letter, treating Samuel's death as primarily a business inconvenience, stood in stark contrast to Catherine's expressions of grief and suggested the very different ways the two Whitfields had viewed Samuel and his place in their lives. Rebecca also found records showing that the timber operation where Samuel died had been cited for safety violations several times in the years before the accident, though no action had been taken beyond small fines that the Whitfield company had paid without making significant changes to their practices. Rebecca shared her findings with James, and together they discussed how to present this complex story in the exhibition. They agreed that the restored portrait should be the centerpiece, displayed in a way that allowed visitors to see both the full composition with Samuel visible and documentation of how he had been painted over. James suggested creating a digital interactive display that would show the portrait in various states, from the overpainted version that had existed for over a century to the UV light images that had revealed the hidden figure to the final restored painting. Rebecca proposed including Samuel's letters and photographs alongside the portrait, giving him a voice and a presence that went beyond his image in the painting. They also decided to include materials about the Whitfield family and the social and economic context of the early 1900s Appalachian region, helping visitors understand the power dynamics and social structures that had shaped the relationships depicted in the portrait. The exhibition, titled Painted Over, Recovering Samuel Garrett, opened 6 months after James had first noticed the anomaly in the UV examination of the Whitfield portrait. The Institute's main gallery had been transformed into a carefully designed space that guided visitors through the story chronologically, beginning with information about the Whitfield family and their place in early 20th century Appalachian society, then introducing Samuel Garrett and the evidence of his relationship with the family, and finally revealing the portrait restoration and the questions it raised about memory, power, and historical erasure. The restored portrait hung on the central wall, dramatically lit and positioned so that visitors encountered it as the culmination of the narrative they had been following. Beside it, a large monitor displayed the digital presentation James had created, allowing visitors to see the various stages of the restoration and to zoom in on details of Samuel's figure and the overpaint that had concealed him. The exhibition attracted immediate attention from both the academic community and the general public, with art historians, conservators, and social historians praising the meticulous research and the thoughtful way the story had been presented. Local and regional media covered the opening extensively, and the story of the painted-over laborer resonated with audiences who saw in it themes that remained relevant more than a century later. Visitors came in large numbers, many spending an hour or more in the gallery, reading the interpretive panels, examining the documents and photographs, and standing before the restored portrait, trying to understand the relationships and tensions it represented. The comment book, filled with reflections on class, race, labor, and the ways that history is shaped by those with the power to control narratives and images. What surprised Rebecca most was the response from descendants of both the Whitfield and Garrett families, many of whom had not known about Samuel or about the controversy surrounding the portrait. Several Whitfield descendants contacted the Institute expressing shock and, in some cases, shame about their ancestors' decision to erase Samuel from the family record. One woman wrote a long letter describing how learning about Samuel had caused her to reconsider her family's history and to recognize that the wealth and status she had always taken pride in had been built on the labor of people like Samuel who had been excluded from the family narrative. Dorothy Jenkins became a frequent presence at the exhibition, bringing other Garrett family members to see Samuel's portrait and the materials that documented his life. For these descendants, seeing Samuel honored and remembered in this public way was deeply meaningful, a recognition of his worth and his story after more than a century of obscurity. The exhibition also sparked conversations about other portraits and historical images that might contain similar erasures or alterations. Rebecca began receiving inquiries from museums, historical societies, and private collectors, asking if James could examine their paintings for evidence of overpaint or other modifications. Several of these examinations revealed hidden figures or altered compositions, suggesting that the practice of painting over unwanted elements of portraits had been more common than previously recognized. Each discovery raised questions about who had been deemed unacceptable for inclusion in family records and why, and about what these erasures revealed about the social anxieties and power structures of different historical periods. Rebecca began planning a follow-up exhibition that would explore these themes more broadly, using multiple examples to examine the politics of representation and memory. James found himself reflecting on the ethical dimensions of his work as a conservator, recognizing that the decision to remove overpaint and reveal what had been hidden was not simply a technical matter, but one that carried significant historical and emotional weight. In the case of the Whitfield portrait, revealing Samuel had been clearly the right choice, bringing to light a story that deserved to be told and honoring someone who had been unjustly erased. But James wondered about other cases where the motivations for concealment might have been different, or where revealing what had been hidden might cause harm to living people. He wrote an article for a conservation journal exploring these questions, using the Whitfield portrait as a case study and arguing that conservators needed to work closely with historians, curators, and communities to make informed decisions about when and how to reveal alterations to historical artworks. As the exhibition continued its successful run, Rebecca worked to expand the historical record of Samuel Garrett beyond what had been included in the initial display. She had been contacted by a genealogist who specialized in African American family history in the Appalachian region, and together they had begun to investigate whether Samuel might have had mixed-race ancestry, which would add another layer of complexity to his story and to Thomas. Whitfield's discomfort with his inclusion in the family portrait. The genealogist had found records suggesting that Samuel's maternal grandmother had been a free woman of color who had married a white man in the years before the Civil War, making Samuel part of a mixed-race family in a region and era where such backgrounds were often concealed or denied. This discovery, while not definitively proven, offered a possible explanation for why Thomas Whitfield had been so determined to remove Samuel from the portrait, as the inclusion of someone with African ancestry in a formal family portrait would have been considered scandalous by many people of that social class in 1901. Rebecca also continued to research Catherine Whitfield, trying to understand what had motivated her to insist on Samuel's inclusion in the portrait and how she had dealt with his death and subsequent erasure from the family image. She found a diary that Catherine had kept during the last years of her life, donated to the Institute by a different branch of the family than the one that had provided the portrait. The diary entries from 1902 and 1903 revealed a woman struggling with grief and guilt, mourning Samuel's death and tormented by her inability to prevent her husband from removing him from the portrait. Catherine wrote about feeling that she had failed Samuel, that her insistence on including him in the portrait had perhaps drawn unwanted attention to him and contributed to the circumstances that led to his death. She also wrote about the constraints of her position as a woman in that era, how despite her wealth and social status, she had limited power to oppose her husband's decisions or to publicly acknowledge relationships that crossed class and possibly racial boundaries. The diary also contained information that cast Samuel's death in a more troubling light. Catherine wrote about conversations she had overheard between Thomas and his business partners in the weeks before the accident, discussions about Samuel that suggested they viewed him as having become too familiar with the family and too confident in his position. She recorded her fear that the accident might not have been entirely accidental, though she had no proof and knew that raising such questions would be futile given her husband's power and influence. Whether Samuel's death had truly been the result of negligence or something more deliberate would probably never be known with certainty, but Catherine's suspicions added a darker dimension to the story and suggested that the erasure of Samuel from the portrait might have been part of a broader effort to eliminate his presence and his memory from the Whitfield family narrative. Rebecca struggled with how much of this information to make public, aware that she was dealing with serious allegations about events that had occurred more than a century ago and involved families whose descendants were still living. She consulted with the Institute's director and with several historians whose judgment she trusted, and together they decided to include the information about Catherine's suspicions in the exhibition materials, but to present it carefully, acknowledging the uncertainty and the impossibility of definitive proof, while also recognizing that Catherine's contemporary account deserved to be taken seriously. They added a new section to the exhibition exploring the circumstances of Samuel's death and the questions that surrounded it, using Catherine's diary entries and the safety violation records to provide context without making accusations that could not be substantiated. The additions to the exhibition generated renewed media attention and brought new visitors to see the portrait and learn about Samuel's story. Some Whitfield descendants were upset by the implications about Thomas Whitfield's possible role in Samuel's death, arguing that the evidence was too thin to justify raising such serious questions. Others acknowledged that the family history was more complicated and troubling than they had previously understood, and expressed appreciation for the Institute's efforts to present a complete and honest account. Dorothy Jenkins and other Garrett descendants felt vindicated by the revelation of Catherine's suspicions, believing that it confirmed what their family had always suspected but had never been able to prove. The controversy and discussion generated by the exhibition demonstrated the ongoing power of historical narratives to affect how people understood their identities and their relationships to the past. 2 years after the exhibition opened, Rebecca published a book based on her research, Into Samuel Garrett and the Whitfield Family Portrait. The book expanded significantly on the exhibition materials, incorporating additional research into the social and economic history of the Appalachian region in the early 1900s, and exploring the broader themes of labor, class, race, and memory that the portrait raised. Rebecca used Samuel's story as a lens through which to examine the lives of working people in that era, the complex relationships that sometimes developed between wealthy families and their employees, and the ways that official histories had often excluded or minimized the contributions and experiences of laborers. The book was well received by both academic and general audiences, winning several awards and being adopted as a text in college courses on Appalachian history and public history methods. The success of the book and the continued interest in the exhibition led to invitations for Rebecca to speak at conferences and universities across the country. She developed a presentation that used the Whitfield portrait as a case study in how historians recover hidden stories and how museums and archives can work with communities to create more inclusive and accurate historical narratives. She emphasized the collaborative nature of the work, crediting James's technical expertise in revealing the overpaint, Dorothy Jenkins's willingness to share family materials and stories, and the contributions of numerous other researchers and community members who had helped piece together Samuel's story. Rebecca argued that this collaborative approach, bringing together conservators, historians, genealogists, and descendant communities, represented a model for how institutions could engage more effectively with the complex and sometimes painful aspects of regional history. James continued his conservation work at the Institute, but the Whitfield Portrait Project had changed how he approached his profession. He became more attentive to the historical and social contexts of the objects he worked on, more willing to spend time researching the stories behind the artworks, rather than focusing solely on their physical restoration. He also became an advocate within the conservation community for greater collaboration with historians and curators, arguing that technical analysis and historical research needed to inform each other to produce the most complete and accurate understanding of historical artworks. He published several articles about the techniques he had used to reveal Samuel's figure and about the ethical considerations involved in deciding whether to remove overpaint, contributing to ongoing professional discussions about the role and responsibilities of conservators. The Whitfield portrait remained on permanent display at the Institute, having become one of the most popular and significant objects in the collection. The Institute developed educational programs around the portrait, bringing school groups to learn about historical research methods and about the social history of the region. Teachers used the story of Samuel Garrett to discuss topics ranging from labor history to the civil rights movement, helping students understand how issues of class and race had shaped Appalachian society and continued to resonate in the present. The portrait also became a site of pilgrimage for descendants of both the Whitfield and Garrett families, a place where they could confront and reflect on their shared and complicated history. Dorothy Jenkins remained actively involved with the Institute, serving on an advisory committee that helped guide the organization's work on projects related to working class and African American history in the region. She worked with Rebecca to create an online archive of materials related to Samuel Garrett and the Garrett family, making documents, photographs, and family stories accessible to researchers and to other descendants who might be interested in learning about their heritage. Dorothy also collaborated with a local playwright to develop a dramatic production based on Samuel's story, a play that premiered at a regional theater and was subsequently performed at schools and community centers throughout the mountains. The play brought Samuel's story to life in a new way, using dramatic interpretation to explore the relationships and tensions that the historical record could only hint at. 5 years after James first noticed the anomalous fluorescence pattern in the Whitfield portrait, the Institute hosted a symposium bringing together conservators, historians, genealogists, and community members to reflect on the project and its impact. The symposium featured presentations on various aspects of the work, from the technical details of the paint analysis and removal to the historical research that had uncovered Samuel's story, to the community engagement that had made the project meaningful to descendants and to the broader public. James and Rebecca co-presented on the collaborative process that had made the project successful, emphasizing how their different areas of expertise had complemented each other and how the involvement of descendant communities had enriched and complicated their understanding of the portrait and its history. The symposium attracted participants from across the country, including several conservators who had subsequently discovered and revealed hidden figures in other portraits, creating a growing body of knowledge about this phenomenon and its historical significance. The symposium also featured a panel of Whitfield and Garrett descendants discussing how learning about Samuel and about the portrait had affected their understanding of their family histories and their own identities. The panelists spoke movingly about the experience of confronting difficult truths about their ancestors, about the importance of acknowledging both the achievements and the failures of previous generations, and about the ongoing work of reconciliation and understanding across lines of class and race. Several panelists described how the project had led them to conduct their own research into family history, uncovering other stories that had been suppressed or forgotten, and working to ensure that these stories would be preserved and shared. The panel discussion was emotional and powerful, demonstrating how historical research could have profound personal impacts and could contribute to healing and understanding in the present. One Whitfield descendant spoke about how discovering Samuel's story had prompted her to examine her own assumptions about privilege and inheritance, leading her to become involved in social justice work in her community. A Garrett descendant described how seeing Samuel honored in the exhibition had given him a sense of pride in his family history that he had never felt before, connecting him to a legacy of hard work and dignity that had been invisible in the official historical narratives he had encountered growing up. Rebecca used the symposium as an opportunity to announce a new initiative that would expand on the work begun with the Whitfield portrait. The Institute would establish a program dedicated to identifying and researching portraits and photographs from the Appalachian region that might contain evidence of erasure or alteration, with the goal of recovering the stories of people who had been deliberately removed from historical records. The program would provide grants to support conservation work, and historical research would create training opportunities for conservators and historians interested in this type of work, and would develop resources and best practices for engaging with descendant communities. Rebecca had secured funding from several foundations and government agencies, and the program would begin accepting applications within the next few months. The announcement was met with enthusiasm, and several people immediately expressed interest in participating or in nominating portraits for examination. Rebecca explained that the program would prioritize projects that involved collaboration with descendant communities and that addressed stories of people who had been marginalized or excluded from historical narratives because of their class, race, or social position. James had been working on a particularly significant project that he revealed at the symposium, a detailed technical study of the overpaint on the Whitfield portrait that had allowed him to identify the specific painter who had covered Samuel's figure. By analyzing the materials and techniques used in the overpaint and comparing them to known works by local artists active in the early 1900s, James had determined that the work had been done by a painter named Robert Morrison, who had operated a studio in Boone and had done various types of commercial artwork, including portrait, painting, sign painting, and decorative work. James had located Morrison's business records, which included an entry for February 1903 recording payment from Thomas Whitfield for alterations to portrait. The discovery provided the final piece of documentary evidence confirming when and by whom Samuel had been painted over, and it also raised questions about Morrison's own feelings about the work he had been hired to do and whether he had understood the significance of what he was being asked to erase. James had found a diary kept by Morrison's daughter that included a brief mention of her father being troubled by a commission he had received to paint over a figure in a family portrait, suggesting that Morrison had recognized the ethical implications of the work even as he accepted the payment. The restored Whitfield portrait had become iconic, reproduced in textbooks and articles about Appalachian history, art conservation, and public history practice. It had been loaned to several major museums for exhibitions about American portraiture and about the history of labor in the United States. Each time the portrait traveled, it attracted new audiences and generated new conversations about the themes it embodied. Rebecca and James had received numerous requests to write about the project and to consult on similar efforts at other institutions, and they had become recognized experts in the field of recovering hidden histories through technical analysis of artworks. But what mattered most to both of them was not the professional recognition, but the knowledge that they had helped restore Samuel Garrett to his rightful place in the historical record, and had honored his memory in a way that his erasure from the portrait had been intended to prevent. Dorothy Jenkins had become a powerful advocate for the recovery of hidden histories, speaking at schools and community organizations about the importance of preserving and honoring the stories of working people and marginalized communities. She had worked with other Garrett family members to create a scholarship fund in Samuel's name, providing financial assistance to young people from working-class backgrounds who wanted to pursue education, fulfilling the dream that Samuel himself had held but had never been able to achieve. The scholarship had already supported a dozen students, several of whom had gone on to become teachers, carrying forward Samuel's aspirations in a tangible way. Dorothy also collaborated with the Institute to create educational materials about Samuel and about labor history in the Appalachian region, resources that were being used in classrooms throughout the area to help students understand the experiences of people whose stories had often been left out of traditional historical narratives. The Institute had also worked to memorialize Samuel at the site where he had died, placing a marker near the location of the former Whitfield timber operation that acknowledged his life and his contributions. The marker had been designed in consultation with Garrett family descendants and included text that honored Samuel's memory, while also acknowledging the broader history of workers who had labored in dangerous conditions and whose sacrifices had built the prosperity of the region. The dedication ceremony for the marker had brought together descendants of both families, along with representatives of labor organizations and community groups, in a powerful demonstration of how historical research and commemoration could contribute to healing and reconciliation. Several speakers at the ceremony reflected on how Samuel's story resonated with contemporary struggles for workers' rights and for recognition of the dignity and value of all people regardless of their social or economic position. Standing before the portrait at the symposium, looking at Samuel's serious young face and his work-worn hands, Rebecca felt a sense of connection across the decades to Catherine Whitfield, who had insisted on including Samuel in the portrait despite the social conventions that made his presence uncomfortable, and to Martha Garrett, who had mourned her son and had believed that his death and his erasure from history were injustices that deserved to be challenged. The work of recovering hidden histories was never finished, Rebecca knew, but each story brought back into the light was a victory against forgetting and a testament to the enduring human need to be seen and remembered. She thought about all the other portraits and photographs that might contain similar erasures, all the other people whose presence had been deemed unacceptable or inconvenient by those with the power to shape historical narratives. The program she had announced would help recover some of those stories, but there would always be more work to do, more voices to recover, more lives to honor. James had already begun examining several other portraits that had been submitted for analysis, finding evidence of alterations in 2 of them that suggested hidden figures similar to what he had discovered in the Whitfield portrait. Each discovery opened up new questions and new research projects, and James felt energized by the knowledge that his technical skills could contribute to this important work of historical recovery. He had trained several younger conservators in the techniques he had developed, ensuring that the work would continue and expand beyond what he could accomplish alone. The field of art conservation was evolving, James believed, moving beyond a narrow focus on preserving physical objects to embrace a broader understanding of how conservation work could contribute to social justice and to more inclusive and accurate historical narratives. The portrait would hang in the Institute's gallery for generations to come, ensuring that Samuel Garrett's story would continue to be told and that his presence, once erased, would never be forgotten again. Visitors would stand before it and learn about the young man who had worked for the Whitfield family, who had been valued by some and made uncomfortable by others, whose inclusion in a family portrait had been controversial enough that he had been painted over after his death. They would learn about Catherine Whitfield's insistence on including him and her grief at his loss, about Thomas Whitfield's discomfort and his decision to erase Samuel from the family record, about the accident that had claimed Samuel's life and the questions that surrounded it. They would learn about the painstaking work of conservation and historical research that had brought Samuel back into visibility, and about the descendants who had worked to honor his memory and ensure his story would be preserved. And perhaps some of those visitors would be inspired to look more carefully at their own family histories, to ask questions about who had been included and who had been left out, to seek out the hidden stories and the erased presences that existed in their own pasts. The Kew portrait was more than just an artwork or a historical artifact. It was a reminder that history was not fixed or settled, but was constantly being recovered and reinterpreted, and that every person's story mattered and deserved to be told.